Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how you can use Redux Toolkit with Redux Saga and all the intricacies that goes with it. Now, I am going to assume that you have basic working knowledge of Redux Saga. If you don't, you can check out my Learn React number 13 video which explains Redux Saga in depth. It's recommended you understand how Redux Saga works because I'm not going to be setting it up from scratch again in this video. It is also recommended that you watch my last video which is on Redux Toolkit, because we're going to be setting up the Redux Toolkit in a pretty fast fashion, and I'm not going to explain all the steps on the way because I did that in the last video. This video is really so that you can see how Redux Saga differs when you use it with Redux Toolkit instead of plain Redux. And if you find value in this video, please consider leaving a comment, subscribing, and maybe tagging some of your friends, sending it to anyone that you know that wants to learn React. I can't tell you how much it helps with the algorithm, and I'm really trying my best to keep on putting consistent videos out there for you guys, and I love seeing all the feedback that you guys are giving me, and thank you so much. It's been amazing interacting with you guys. So without further ado, let us get started. As you can see, I have the application that we made in video number 13 open over here, and just to give you guys a refresher, it's a pretty simple application. The only thing that Redux Saga is being used here for is for getting all these users. And if you don't remember, we created pretty much a fake endpoint that would just return a list of users. You can see if I actually go there, it'll return this user, Anthony Sestilli, with the ID 1. Now, that's not actually the users that are being shown over here at the bottom. It's just the person that's being showed up here. So for simplicity's sake, we're only going to be working with that one Redux call. And showing you how you can do that with Redux Toolkit. So the nice part about this is the difference between Redux and Redux Toolkit when using Redux Saga is very, very small. In fact, if you remember, for Redux Saga, we split things up into three main parts. The root saga, which has our watcher that will watch for a Redux action and then call a Redux Saga handler. The Redux Saga handler that will essentially call the request and actually get the data and determine what to do with that data. And then, of course, the request, which is essentially just an Axios request, which will actually call the server. So the order of it, just to refresh you guys, goes: the action is called from the front end via Redux. Our watcher saga takes that action from Redux and calls our handler. Our handler will then tell our request to make the call and handle the data that the request brings back. And in between that, the request will just make and return the API request and the data from the API request. The handler will then take that data and decide what they want to do with that data. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to set up Redux Toolkit again. Now, the cool part of this is Redux Toolkit, if you have a mix of regular Redux reducers, like for example, we have two reducers here. We have our user reducer, which is what we're going to end up changing, and our counter reducer, which we're not going to touch in this video. If you switch your configure store and do all the stuff we did last video with setting it up so it all comes from Redux Toolkit instead of Redux Saga, then it doesn't actually stop the regular Redux reducers from working. So I'm going to pause the video and switch everything over. If you want to see how I switched everything over, you can watch my last video, but I won't waste your time in this video with doing the switch over, so let's do it. Alright, and that is pretty much done. So just to give you a brief explanation of what happened, we pretty much just swapped our entire configure store from Redux to Redux Toolkit. The main difference is, as there's not much, you'll notice in the last video, it looks almost the same as it did in the last videos, except we're now setting up the Saga middleware, and inside of this, configure store where we specify what middlewares we want to use, I'm just going to go ahead and import Saga middleware, create Saga middleware, and create a Saga middleware and just add that to the end of the middlewares array. And of course, if you had any more middlewares, you could put a comma here and add whatever middlewares you wanted to add more stuff like Redux Logger, for example, but that's for another video. So now that we have our configure store set up, we can go ahead and turn what we have over here, this user reducer pretty much into a user slice. So let's go ahead and create a file and call this a user slice. Bop. And then we're going to go over to our intermediate React tutorial, and we're just going to copy this slice format, because it's just easy to sort of, and I do this a lot, and I like to do this a lot. I like to keep the documentation open, especially when it's something I'm still trying to learn, and maybe this might be helpful for you guys to do as well. I like to just keep something that I find that contains the skeleton of what I'm trying to make, and then I just like to hollow it out, and I sort of get used to it like that. So for example, this is called to-do slice. We're going to go ahead and if you highlight something, and this goes for Code Sandbox and VS Code, and you click Control D, it'll highlight other instances of it as well. So I can go ahead and rename this to-do slice in all these places, from to-do slice to user slice. And you'll see it updated over here, but it also updated at the bottom and over here as well. Just a cool little hotkey that you guys might find useful. So let's change the name to user. Let's create the initial state. So the initial state, if we go back at what our original user is, we can see the initial state is an object where the user is undefined. So we have two options here. We can either A, make our initial state for here pretty much the same, an object with the user undefined, or we can, since this is just going to be used for our user, and our user object is going to be essentially what we're going to be editing, and I don't plan on, adding more variables other than just user, we can just go ahead and make the initial state of our user state, our initial state of our user slice, just an empty object. And instead of having an empty object with a user object and then having stuff inside that user object, we're going to just treat this like the user object and just put in all the stuff that would normally be in the user object just at the top level of this object instead, just to keep things a bit more clean. And you can always refactor something like that afterwards. So now let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is we're going to hollow out these reducers. Now this is where the cool part comes. So you can see here, for example, we have two calls. One is get user and one is set user. And it's a bit extraneous, because this get user is pretty much an action that has no action in our reducer, because what it's being used for is just triggering this root saga take latest, right? So what I like to do for stuff like that, and it saves you a lot of code, because you don't need to go ahead and declare get user over here and then declare it over here as well, which takes up a lot of space. And if you have multiple API calls, multiple things that are going to be triggering actions in your Redux Saga, you're going to have a bunch of these sort of actions that don't really do anything, that you're just declaring for the sake of declaring, and they're taking up 4 or 5 lines of code every time you want to declare it. Let's go ahead and hollow out these reducers. What you can do is you can just, for example, and this is one of the reasons that I really like Redux Saga, Redux Toolkit, is you can pretty much just declare get user as an empty function, and that's it. And you don't have to, spend all these lines of saying, okay, we're going to make a new action called get user, and then we're going to go ahead after we have get user, and we're going to, have to declare the action type and any variables that you might want to pass in and stuff like that, because all of that will just get put into the payload of the action anyways. So it saves you a lot of code and a lot of boilerplate code that if you want to make a new thing over and over again. So we have our get user, and we can go ahead and export that. And then the next thing we have is pretty much our set user action. And our set user action is going to be pretty straightforward. So we're essentially going to create it. It's going to be looking something like this. We're going to have the state, and we're going to have the action itself. And then, of course, we can essentially just, whatever we get back from the action, so const user data is going to be equal to action on payload. Whatever essentially is being passed in, we can probably just set it to the state. So we can just go ahead and return state, just in case it doesn't override all the state variables that are already in there. And then, of course, we can just spread our user data. And what this will do is, let's say, for example, for an example, if our current user state looks something like, ID 3, name Anthony, last name, Stilly, and let's say role is I don't know, like software engineer. And then let's say, for example, we get the user again, but this time, you know, it probably won't happen in this example, but let's say, for example, if you were using an API that would just, when you get the user, it would just, let's say you pass in a parameter to only get the role of a user, and it returns something like role, you know, as let's say senior software engineer, let's say it updated, this would make it so that when it returned, it would return all the old data and then overwrite only what the new data has. So that's the purpose of spreading the initial state, which will say, okay, we want the new state to be all of this, and then also spreading the new data we get, which is saying, okay, but we want to replace any of this data with anything that matches from here. So essentially, your end result will be this, what it used to be before, but this role will now change to senior software engineer. So that's, I think I explained this in the regular Redux video. But just as a refresher, because I know the syntax can be a bit confusing since we're using a Redux Toolkit and things are different. So now we've set up our get user and our set user. We can go ahead and export both of those actions. Now let's go ahead and start using it. So first things first, let's use the get user thing. So let's go ahead into our application that actually dispatches get user. And over here, instead of importing get user from, you know, over here, we can just simply import it from our new user slice, and that probably will just work straight up. So you'll see here that it's not actually making the call. So what's happening is this action is getting dispatched, but our Redux Saga is now listening. It's still listening to the old get user coming from that duck. We want it to listen to the new get user. And here's one of the other nuances that comes with Redux Toolkit. So I'm going to go ahead and import get user from the user slice. But if you remember, our user slice will export this entire action all at once. So in order to get the actual action type that you want to listen to, you would have to replace that with get user and then do .type. And you'll see here, there we go. Now the call is being made. Now, the reason we're doing this is because if you look at what we had before we were exporting and you know, taking the latest of this get user coming from the old reducer. And that was essentially a string of the action's name. And in the name for an action in Redux is known as the type. So when I am now doing get user.type, what's actually being returned here, if I were to, for example, console.log that, I can actually come in here, since we're exporting get user in here as well, I can go ahead and console.log, you know, like calling get user, and I can console.log get user .type, so you can see what that .type actually is. You'll see here that the type is a string that is user/get user, and that is what Redux on behind the scenes is looking for, and that's what Redux Saga, when you tell it to get latest of some action.type, it is pretty much going to listen for any action that gets dispatched where its type is essentially this. And when we dispatch that action over here, behind the scenes, Redux is saying, okay, the action that got dispatched was, you know, user/get user, and that's what the root Saga is listening for. So just another one of the nuances that Redux Toolkit brings to the table when you're using it with Redux Saga, as opposed to just using Redux vanilla. So now that we've gone ahead and we've made the API call, and you can see the API call is being made properly with the new user slice. However, in our handler, let's close all of this. If we go over to our handler, we'll see that our handler is still using the set user from the old reducer over here. And also our application is still reading the data from our old data. So let's go ahead and fix that one by one. So over here, instead of putting a set user from our old reducer, what we can do is we can replace that with the user slice. So we're calling that from our user slice, but it won't actually just straight up get that data anymore. And the reason for that is when we call set user, what we actually have to remember is that Redux Saga is essentially going to be using, because we're using a Redux Toolkit, we are essentially calling and setting the payload. So we no longer can just call setUser and pass in one variable, because Redux Toolkit doesn't have a way to specify that. When we want to specify something, we always have to now put it as in we are setting the payload for something. And when you set the payload, it's essentially just going to be an action, or sorry, an object. So when we call setUser from our user slice, we can pass in our data and we can destructure our data so that everything will be put into the payload object. And when we come over here, so let's go ahead and come into our user slice and let's console.log. So console.log, we are in the user slice for setting user. And now let's console.log what this user data actually looks like. So let's console.log user data. And you can see here, oops, let's see, is this actually getting called? So let's make sure that we did that properly. In our handler, we're getting setUser from the user slice, and we are putting over here that looks correct. So let's just make sure one more time. This is the proper setUser. Yep. So this should be getting called. Let's see, for example, what? Let's try debugging over here. So we can see that on our end, it looks like we should be calling it. So first of all, let's do a bit of debugging and let's console log the data to see if we're actually getting the data back. So you can see here we're console logging the data and we're getting the data back. So the problem is happening on this setUser. So let's go ahead and make sure that we did everything in the setUser correctly. We come over here, we see setUser is an action. We've exported it correctly. Everything looks fine on the surface. However, after a bit of debugging, I realized that in my configure store, I never actually set the user reducer from the regular user reducer to user slice, which means it wasn't really connected to the store. So I'm not sure how, I guess the get user one worked. I guess it might still have been using the last one. It's actually sort of weird. It might just be some weird little thing in Redux where if you try to edit the Redux store itself, I guess you can still fire objects from something that isn't added to the store, but since we were trying to set something in a Redux store, that didn't work, which sort of makes sense actually. But now you can see we are actually in the user slice and it looks like we are setting the data properly. So we can go ahead, get rid of all these console logs, just like this. And now the last step is to replace in our app where we are getting the state, pretty much replace that that data. So we can come over here, and over here, I think we still called it the user object. So let's go ahead and try doing one of these, and bam. We can see here our user object is now coming from state.user, which is essentially just the top level of our user slice. And if we go ahead and console.log the user here, and oh, we already are doing that over there, and we can see that it's pretty much being set properly. Now the last nuance with Redux Toolkit and Redux Saga I want to show you is when we make that get user, how we can pass data in to the API request. Because if you remember, and let me close all this stuff, if you remember over here in the user slice, this get user is just an empty function, and one of the main things in Redux was, you know, when you declared an action, you passed in all the variables that you wanted to be available in that action. And what you can actually do here is in our get user, it'll pass whatever you pass in as one big payload object. So I can, for example, let's get rid of these console logs, pass in an object, and I can say like test is equal to the variable hi. I can say like, you know, if I wanted to pass in a specific ID, I could pass an ID like 1. And if I come into my handler where we actually start using this, you can see we have action over here. We can actually go ahead and destructure the payload from the action. And let's console.log that payload to see what we have inside. And you can see in that payload, we have the variables that we passed in. So if we wanted to, for example, pass in variables like that to our blank action, we could just go ahead and pass them in as one object. And when we want to use them wherever it is, we can just get that from the payload, which comes from action, and use it however we want. So if we wanted to, you know, pass this into the request get user, let's say we wanted to pass the ID in, we could do it like so. And then we would go ahead and modify the request get user. But that is pretty much it for Redux Toolkit and Redux Saga. So to recap, the nuances we saw, number one, the whole switching over to the slices and having your blank actions like that. Number two, the action.payload over here, and actually passing in the set user stuff in your handler as an object. And of course, number three, what we just went over, which is passing in any data that you want in the blank action that you are using to make the call. So yeah, that is it. If you found value in this video, please consider leaving a comment, subscribing, liking this video. It means so much to me and it helps a lot with the YouTube algorithm. And I hope you are all staying safe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.